On the evening of December 15th, 1973, at the Gaumont Marignan Theatre in Paris, Marlon Brando was sitting on stage answering questions when a man in the third row stood up and called him a fraud. The premiere of Last Tango in Paris had just ended. 2,000 people filled the theater. Brando had been on stage for 20 minutes, giving short answers to questions about the film. Then the man stood. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark suit, and his voice carried through the room. "Mr. Brando," he said in English with a French accent, "you are a pretender, an actor playing at depth. You are a fraud." The theater went silent. Brando stared at the man for 5 seconds. Then Brando stood up, walked down the steps from the stage, moved through the front rows, and stopped directly in front of the man. He shouted one word, "Liar!" Then Brando turned and walked out of the theater. 2,000 people sat in shocked silence. The moderator froze on stage. The press scrambled for their notebooks, and for 42 years nobody knew who the man was or why Brando had reacted the way he did, until 2015, when a French journalist tracked him down and discovered the truth. The man's name was André Dubois, and what he revealed on his deathbed changed everything people thought they understood about that night. The Gaumont Marignan Theatre on the Champs-Élysées was packed that night, every seat filled, international press, French celebrities, film critics from around the world. Last Tango in Paris had been controversial for months, the explicit content, Bernardo Bertolucci's direction, and Brando delivering what many called the rawest performance of his career. The film screened at 7:30. At 9:45, the lights came up to scattered applause. At 10 o'clock, Brando walked onto the stage and sat down in a chair facing the audience. He looked tired, heavier than people remembered, his hair longer and graying. A moderator, French film critic Jean-Pierre Léaud, sat beside him. The first questions were standard. A woman asked about working with Bertolucci. Brando said, "Bernardo is talented. We worked well together." A man asked what drew him to the role. Brando said, "The character was complex." Short answers, polite but disengaged. 20 minutes in, the man in the third row stood up. He didn't wait to be called on, just started speaking, his voice loud and clear. "Mr. Brando, I have a question. Why do you pretend to be profound when you are merely performing? You are not an artist. You are a pretender playing at depth. You are a fraud." The room went dead silent. Not a question, an accusation. The moderator opened his mouth to intervene, but Brando's posture changed before anyone could speak. Brando's hands, resting on his knees, went still. His head came up. He looked directly at the man. 5 seconds passed. The only sound was the ventilation system humming. Then Brando stood. He walked down the 3 steps from the stage. The moderator said something in French, maybe asking where he was going, but Brando didn't respond. He moved through the first row, then the second, people pulling their legs back to let him pass. He stopped in the third row, directly in front of the man. The man was still standing. Now he looked less certain. Brando was bigger, closer, 2 feet away. Brando didn't touch him, didn't make any gesture, just stood there, staring. The man opened his mouth, to speak, to apologize, but before any words came out, Brando shouted, "Liar!" The word exploded through the theater, not a raised voice, a shout, raw and violent. The acoustics amplified it, bouncing it off the walls, making it seem to come from everywhere. People in nearby rows flinched. The man stepped back, bumping into the seat behind him. Brando stared at him for 3 more seconds. Then Brando turned around. He walked back up the aisle, past the shocked faces, past the press section. He pushed through the exit doors. They swung shut with a heavy thud. The theater remained silent for 10 seconds. Then voices erupted, people talking over each other. The moderator tried to speak, but nobody listened. Press members rushed toward the exits. The man who'd been shouted at sat down quickly, his face pale, and disappeared into the crowd. Outside, Brando walked past the theater entrance and flagged down a taxi. He got in and gave the driver an address. The car pulled away. Brando sat in the back seat looking out the window at the Paris streets. By midnight, the story was everywhere. Reporters calling Brando's hotel. By morning, French newspapers ran headlines. Brando storms out of premiere. Actor shouts at critic, abandons event. By afternoon, the story had spread internationally. Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, The New York Times, everyone covered it. Theories emerged. Was Brando having a breakdown? Was he drunk? Had the critic crossed a line? Nobody knew. And the man who'd shouted the accusation vanished. No interviews, no statements, just disappeared into the Paris night. Brando checked out of his hotel the next morning and flew to Los Angeles. He didn't give interviews, didn't issue statements, just left. And that's when something interesting happened. Or rather, didn't happen. Brando didn't sue, didn't file charges, didn't have his lawyers send cease and desist letters. The man had publicly humiliated him in front of 2,000 people and international press, and Brando did nothing. Brando canceled all scheduled interviews about Last Tango in Paris. When journalists called, his assistant said, "Mr. Brando is unavailable." When press outlets requested statements, the response was silence. He didn't defend the film, didn't defend himself, didn't explain what happened, just refused to discuss it. For weeks, reporters tried to get a comment. Anyone who worked with Brando was asked about the incident. His assistant said, "Marlon doesn't want to talk about Paris." Director Elia Kazan, asked by a journalist, said, "I haven't spoken to Marlon about it. That's his business." The man who'd shouted the accusation was never identified. French newspapers tried to track him down. The theater couldn't provide information. The premiere had been invitation only, but guests could bring plus ones. Nobody remembered his name. Nobody had seen him before. He'd just disappeared, and Brando never mentioned him, not once, not in interviews, not in conversations, not even to people close to him. Just complete silence. People who knew Brando noticed something else. After Paris, he never returned to France for a film premiere. Not in 1974, not in 1978 for Superman, not in 1979 for Apocalypse Now. Studios would request his presence. Brando would decline. No explanation, just no. Years passed. The Paris incident became part of Brando's mythology. Another story about his volatility, his unpredictability. But the man's identity remained a mystery until 2015. A French journalist named Claire Martineau was working on a retrospective article about Last Tango in Paris for the film's 42nd anniversary. She'd been researching the premiere incident, reading old newspaper coverage, interviewing people who'd been there. Most remembered the shout. Nobody knew who the man was. Then Martineau found something. A photograph from that night, taken by a press photographer in the back of the theater. The photo showed Brando on stage during the Q&A, and in the third row, barely visible, a man's profile. The photo was grainy, but it was something. Martineau contacted the photographer, now retired and living in Lyon. He still had his negatives. She asked if he remembered anything about the man in the third row. "No," the photographer said, "but I took several shots before the incident. Let me check." 2 days later, the photographer sent Martineau a clearer photo, the man's face, visible enough to work with. Martineau started showing the photo to people who'd attended the premiere. Most didn't recognize him. Then she showed it to a retired theater employee who'd worked at the Gaumont Marignan in the 1970s. "That's André Dubois," the man said. "I remember him. He used to come to premieres sometimes, haven't seen him in years." Martineau tracked down André Dubois. He was 84 years old, living in a care facility in Marseille, dying of cancer. She contacted the facility and requested an interview. Dubois agreed. When Martineau arrived, Dubois was in bed, pale and frail. She showed him the photograph. "Is this you?" Dubois looked at it for a long time, then nodded. "Yes, that's me." "Do you remember what happened that night?" Dubois closed his eyes. "I remember everything." And then he told her. André Dubois had been an actor, not a successful one. He'd trained at a Paris conservatory in the 1950s, moved to New York in the early 1960s trying to break into American films. He'd auditioned for dozens of roles, character parts, supporting roles. He was good enough to get called in, never good enough to get cast. In 1970, he auditioned for a role in The Godfather, made it to the final callbacks, lost the part to someone else, then heard later that Marlon Brando had been cast in the lead. Dubois hadn't even been considered for Brando's role. He'd auditioned for a smaller part, but something about knowing Brando was in the film burned. In 1972, Dubois heard about Last Tango in Paris. Bertolucci was casting. Dubois auditioned, got a callback, then lost the part. Again, Brando was cast in the lead. Again, Dubois had auditioned for a different role. But again, the association stung. Dubois moved back to Paris in 1973. His American acting career dead. He was 42 years old, broke, bitter. He'd spent 15 years auditioning for roles in films that went on to star Marlon Brando. He knew it wasn't rational. Brando hadn't taken his parts. They'd been auditioning for different roles, but rationality had nothing to do with it. When Dubois heard about the Last Tango premiere in Paris, something snapped. "I bought a ticket," Dubois told Martineau. "Not an invitation, a regular ticket. I sat in the third row and planned what I would say. I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt my career. I knew calling him a fraud in front of 2,000 people would destroy him, would humiliate him, and I wanted that." Martineau asked what happened after Brando shouted and left. I left immediately, slipped out the side exit before anyone could ask who I was. I went home and waited for the news. Expected Brando to make a statement, to defend himself, to sue me. Something. Did he? Nothing, not a word, not a lawsuit, not even a quote about the incident. Just silence. Dubois' voice was bitter. I waited for 40 years waiting for him to acknowledge what I'd done, to fight back, to prove I'd gotten to him, but he never did. He never mentioned it. Never mentioned me, just acted like I didn't exist. Martineau asked if Dubois regretted it. Dubois stared at the ceiling. I thought I'd won that night. I thought I'd destroyed him in front of the world, but I didn't, because he never gave me the satisfaction of knowing I'd hurt him. He just walked away, and I spent 40 years being nobody, while he went on being Marlon Brando. 3 weeks after the interview, André Dubois died. Martineau published her article in Le Monde on November 12, 2015. The headline, "The Man Who Shouted at Brando, a 42-year mystery solved." The article included Dubois' confession, his identity, his motivation, and his admission that his attempt to destroy Brando had failed because Brando had refused to engage. The story went international. Variety picked it up, The Hollywood Reporter. Film historians commented on it, and people who'd known Brando saw something they'd suspected all along. Brando had known exactly what Dubois was, an envious failed actor looking for attention, and Brando had given him nothing. No lawsuit, because lawsuits give legitimacy. No statement, because statements create dialogue. No acknowledgement, because acknowledgement feeds envy. Just silence. Complete, total silence. Dubois had spent 40 years waiting for Brando to react. Brando had spent 40 years refusing to play. Jack Nicholson, asked about the revelation in a 2016 interview, said, "That sounds like Marlon. He understood power better than anyone I knew, and he understood that envy only has power if you feed it. So he starved it, just walked away and never looked back." Director Francis Ford Coppola said, "Marlon told me once, the people who hate you want your attention more than the people who love you, so give them nothing." I think that's what he did in Paris, gave the guy nothing. The story of what happened in Paris on December 15, 1973, isn't about a shouting match. It's about what happened after the shout. Brando walked out of that theater and never mentioned André Dubois, not once. For 31 years, until Brando died in 2004, he never spoke the man's name. Never acknowledged the incident beyond that one paragraph in his autobiography where he said he was tired of performing. Dubois spent 42 years waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for Brando to fight back, to defend himself, to prove that the attack had landed, but Brando never did, because Brando understood something Dubois didn't. Envy feeds on attention, on reaction, on acknowledgement. The moment you engage with envy, you give it power, you validate it, you tell the envious person that they matter enough to fight. Brando refused. He walked out of that theater, flew home, canceled interviews, stopped discussing the film, and never ever mentioned the man who'd tried to destroy him. Not because he was hurt, not because he was scared, but because he recognized what he was dealing with. A bitter, failed actor looking for one moment of significance, one moment where he'd brought down a legend. Brando refused to give him that moment. He gave him silence instead. And silence is the one thing envy can't survive, because envy needs a fight, needs drama, needs acknowledgement. Without it, envy just consumes the person carrying it, which is exactly what happened to André Dubois. He spent 42 years carrying the weight of that moment, waiting for Brando to react, growing more bitter as the years passed and the reaction never came, dying in a care facility in Marseille, anonymous, forgotten, admitting to a journalist that his greatest moment, the night he'd humiliated Marlon Brando, had meant nothing because Brando had refused to let it mean anything. That's the real story of the Paris premiere, not the shout, the silence after. Brando walked out, and then stayed out. Never gave Dubois another thought, never gave him another word, just erased him through indifference. And Dubois, who'd wanted to destroy Brando's dignity, ended up destroying his own, because he spent the rest of his life waiting for a reaction that never came, waiting for Brando to prove he'd been hurt, waiting for vindication, but vindication never arrived. Because Brando had recognized envy the moment Dubois stood up in that theater, had seen the bitterness, the desperation, the need for acknowledgement. And Brando, who'd spent his whole life being called names by critics and colleagues and strangers, knew exactly how to respond. He didn't. He just walked away, gave one shout, "Liar," and then never gave Dubois another second of his time. That's not weakness, that's strategy. That's understanding that some battles aren't worth fighting because winning requires lowering yourself to the level of the person attacking you. Brando refused to lower himself. He just walked out. And in walking out, he won. Because 42 years later, when the story finally came out, people didn't remember André Dubois' accusation. They remembered Brando's silence, his refusal to engage, his understanding that dignity isn't about fighting back, it's about knowing when not to fight at all. The man in Paris wasn't Brando's past, wasn't his trauma, wasn't his wound. He was just a bitter stranger looking for attention. And Brando gave him one word, liar, then spent the next 31 years proving that some people aren't worth your energy. That's the lesson, not the shout, the silence that followed, the refusal to play, the understanding that power isn't in having the last word, it's in refusing to give someone else the fight they're looking for. Brando walked out of that theater on December 15th, 1973, and he never walked back, never explained, never defended, never acknowledged, just walked away, and let André Dubois spend 42 years waiting for a reaction that would never come. That's not destruction, that's mastery. Because Brando understood what Dubois never learned. Envy dies in silence, and the best revenge isn't fighting back. It's living well enough that the person who tried to hurt you becomes irrelevant. Brando did that for 31 years, until he died in 2004, having never once mentioned André Dubois by name. And Dubois, he died in 2015, admitting that his greatest moment had been meaningless, that he'd spent 42 years waiting for acknowledgement from a man who'd forgotten him the moment he walked out of that theater. That's the real story. Not the scandal, the silence, not the shout. What came after? Brando shouted, "Liar!" then refused to give envy anything else. No fuel, no attention, no acknowledgement, just silence. Complete, total, devastating silence. And in that silence, Brando won.